All right, we are here. Philosophy for the people with the great Karlo Broussard, my very, very good friend, my intellectual sparring partner, often behind the scenes. Carlo's a man I always love jamming with and brainstorming ideas with. And in fact, Carlo, the topic of our conversation, the new relativism, which is your new book. Sorry, I've got the fake background, so it's hard to see. There it is. I remember when we were on the phone. I forget how long ago it was, but you kind of threw this idea out in its seed form. And I remember thinking, hey, that's a really cool idea at the time. And here it is. So it's cool.
Here it is, man.
It's cool to see it manifest, man. Congratulations. And
thank you, buddy. Yeah. And I appreciate your thoughts too and helping me think through it. Yeah. It started out as a project to target good old fashioned relativism. I wanted to write a book on relativism. We had published a long time ago here at Catholic Answers Press, Chris Stefanik's Absolute Relativism booklet. And so we had the idea of trying to beef that up a little bit and make a book, right, on relativism in order to plug that gap in our catalog. And so I set out to target good old-fashioned relativism.
Good old-fashioned relativism.
Right? Yeah, but I started coming across the claim in my research that relativism was dead, passé. As Trent Hart said to me in a conversation in the office, he was like, man, Karlo, that's 2005 apologetics.
Might as well write a book against the new atheism or something at this point.
Right. It's kind of passé, right? And so I thought, to my dismay, that I would have to scrap my book project because I was coming across this claim both in non-Christian and Christian circles. So there was one gentleman for the New York Times, for example, writing a piece saying how college campuses used to be awash in moral relativism, but not anymore. It's now moral judgment that's prevailing among college campuses, a hotbed for the shame culture, sort of a moral crusade against all of those who violate the absolute values of inclusion and tolerance. And even in Christian circles, there was a piece in Christianity Today where a gentleman was arguing that Christians need to come to grips with the fact that the moral relativist is long gone because we live in an era of moral indignation. And even a Catholic gal who used to work for Focus, now at the University of Colorado, was making a claim on a podcast that relativism is dead, and in its place now is the new moral absolutism. So if you think about it, this is not entirely off base, because how can you be a relativist if you're constantly making moral claims and you're constantly shaming people that you ought not to do X, Y, or Z, or be or say X, Y, or Z? And so I thought to myself, holy cow, I got to scrap my book project, man. I was distraught, right?
Yeah. My baby.
That's right. But as I started thinking through some of these modern moral absolutes that fall under the general label of wokeism, all right, the woke culture, I began to discover that when you scratch the surface, pull back the veil, take off the mask, these modern absolutes are really just a guise for good old-fashioned relativism.
Yeah, it's like, what's a Scooby-Doo meme where he pulls off the mask, right? Who's really behind all this? It's still you, relativism.
Oh, man, Pat, I wish you would have shared that with me a long time ago. I could have put that in the introduction of the book or something.
Yeah, right? I have a few genius moments. That's probably all I have today. Yeah, it's not even close to genius, but anyways.
So, for example, one key example, we'll talk a little bit more about this, is, thou shalt not be a white supremacist. Well, if you look at critical race theory, one of these claimed earmarks of white culture or white supremacy culture is objectivity. And the claim that there is a single truth is viewed to be white supremacy. And so I came across that claim and I was like, well, wait a minute, that's just total relativism right there, saying that there's no truth. And to even say that there is a truth, you're somehow a bad person, you're a white supremacist. And so then I started thinking, well, I know there are maybe some others that may very well be like this. Thou shalt not be intolerant. The modern view of tolerance is an egalitarian view of tolerance, which states every lifestyle choice or belief is equal and valid. Well, if every lifestyle choice is equal and valid, that means no lifestyle choice can be right and another wrong. Well, that's just moral relativism. And so I started thinking through these others, thinking, well, I wonder if there are other modern moral absolutes within wokeism that fit this paradigm.
Yeah.
Where relativism is lurking behind the verbiage of absolutism, such that these modern moral absolutes aren't really absolutes. It's really just relativism under the appearance of absolutism.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thesis, because it's kind of the reverse of what you commonly hear. It's like, oh, look, moral relativism, once you kind of like pull away the mask, is really committed to moral absolutism, right?
Yeah.
We'll talk about that, right? But you're like, well, it's kind of actually flipped, right? A lot of the moral absolutism that we see on the scene today, when you pull away the mask, it's good old-fashioned relativism, right?
Absolutely, Pat. Yeah, you nailed it on the head, because not too long ago, we would have been writing a book to expose the absolutism of relativism.
Right. Yeah. Now we're spelling the relativism of absolutism. How about that?
That's right. So rather than exposing how relativism is actually absolutism, there is no truth. Well, that's an absolute claim. Now we're exposing the relativism that lurks behind the modern moral absolutism. Right. So when I began to see that all of these modern moral absolutes, some more relative, like some exemplify relativism more than others. Sure. Some of them, I admit, you got to dig a little deeper. And then you see that it's at least very close to relativism. And if not relativism, at least a practical relativism, such that truth might as well not even exist. Yeah. Since there's no care for the truth embedded within the thinking behind some of these modern moral absolutes. I realized, Pat, I got a book here.
It's not dead, right? Yeah, no.
Yeah, it's not cool. Dead. That's basically the thesis of the book, is to show that relativism is not dead, that it's alive and well, and it's actually more sinister than it was before, Pat. Yeah. Because on two counts. Number one, the new relativism is new because rather than it being blatantly in your face, it's subtle and lurking behind absolute claims that the unsuspecting person, when taken on face value, will adopt. Nobody wants to be a white supremacist, at least people of goodwill, right? Nobody wants to be a jerk who's always being judgmental, bigoted, or hateful. So on face value, when you interpret those commands or those absolutes in a common sense way, we're like, yeah, I can get on board with this stuff. But for someone who's not capable intellectually to think through it and to inquire as to what it really means within modern culture, they will begin to sip on that relativistic thinking lurking behind it, right? Yes. So this new relativism now is more sinister because it's subtle and lurking behind the mask of the absolutism, which the unsuspecting person will adopt. Secondly, it's new in as much as now it is militant relativism, as opposed to the old relativism, which was nice relativism.
Sure,
so,
yeah.
Yeah, so think about it. Not too long ago, relativism was you have your truth, I have mine. Let's agree to disagree, and we'll get on our merry way. There was a sort of nice tone to it. And I suspect that probably that's why a lot of people embraced it. Like, I want to be a nice guy. I want to be a nice person. So I embrace relativism.
Right. It's kind of like the older atheists. They had a much nicer tone than the new atheists. There was something, and there was something like obviously stupider about the new atheists that like the meanness sort of made up for. That made them very popular, right? And
that's right.
Yeah,
and often too, when you know you don't have a good argument, you tend to get more emotional, right?
Nasty, right?
You get a little nastier. That's right. In order to dig deep, but the new relativism is militant relativism, because rather than it being your truth, my truth, it's my truth, not your truth. And there is a demand for others to conform to that relative truth, that truth that the individual judges to be so, or a particular group of individuals judges to be so. And that would be a manifestation of cultural relativism as opposed to individual or I say relativism.
Yeah, well, that's good. All right, great thesis. That's going to give us plenty to work with in this conversation. Of course, for the full treatment, we're going to encourage people to get the book. We'll talk more about that at the end. So I don't know, maybe we just start by helping people to understand some of the old-fashioned relativism that's lurking behind the scenes. You've got three in the book. We have total relativism, moral relativism, maybe call that personal relativism or old-fashioned subjectivism, and then we have cultural relativism. So in terms of just understanding terms, Karlo, what do people need to know before we start going any further into this conversation?
Yeah, so total relativism is basically, also philosophers call it global relativism. I know Ed Feser labeled it as global relativism. Others label it as total relativism, which is basically saying there is no truth whatsoever, no absolute truth whatsoever. Whether we're talking about morality, religion, history, science, math, etc. There's just no truth. And truth is simply relative to what the individual judges. And so we have literally, the claim entails, we have our own distinct realities where there is no, it's not merely a disagreement. Like you have your judgment, I have my judgment about some objective reality. Maybe one's right, the other's wrong. It's literally our own distinct realities.
Everything is stance dependent, right?
That's right. So that's the total relativistic view. And what I did in researching through these modern moral absolutes, there were a few of them that had similar characteristics that would fit under this category of total relativism. So that's what I do in the first section of the book. I explain what total relativism is. I give you 3 examples of modern moral absolutes that I see fit within that total relativism category. And then I have a subsection where I actually do good old-fashioned apologetics and refute total relativism. The idea of responding to the claim there is no absolute truth. Well, is that absolutely true? If you say no, then you falsify relativism. If you say yes, well, then you violate the principle of non-contradiction because you're saying it's absolutely true that there's no absolute truth. We've all heard that standard line.
But it's a good standard line, right? I mean, this is like, hey, we play the hits and they're hits for a reason, right? And like this has always been obviously the least interesting form of relativism to me because it seems to have this self-defeat issue. And then, whenever this is what you often see in philosophy, when people sort of bump up against issues of self-defeat, they start to sort of restrict their claims, right? Until maybe it doesn't consume itself. And that's where you get to the more restricted forms of relativism, which we'll get to. I'm trying to think, Karlo, if I've ever met an actual total met one. You see him online, of course, right? For people who don't know better. I have met a very strong form moral personal relativist. And that was my first ethics professor. I've told this story before, but my first ethics professor was, card carrying, like right on day one, let's get the students on board with the relativistic project. So they definitely exist. They're out there. And it was like the most cartoon version that you could ever imagine of an actual personal relativist. I almost hesitate to tell the story because when I do it, it just sounds so fanciful that it's made up. Because we literally got into these basic responses where she pretty much fell into every single one of the traps, right? So I was objecting to the relativism she was pushing forward, Karlo. And then she at one point told me to pipe down, essentially. I'm like, well, professor, I value piping up. I value speaking over you and everybody else in the class. And this is right after she told us that we're not to impose other people's values, right? Our values.
That's actually
people, right.
That's actually chapter 2 of my book in Total Relativism.
Yeah, but this literally played out in real life, which is the crazy thing. And then she's kind of stuck. She doesn't know what to say. So she's like, well, maybe if you thought about it more, you would decide that you do value other people's opinions. So of course, I'm just kind of like, I was younger, a little bit more jerkish, right? I try to do better, but I was like, no, just thought about it. Totally want to keep talking, professor. Right. So we keep going back and forth on this. And then at some point, the point was sufficiently impressed, at least for the other students who found it very entertaining. And I just sort of let it go. But the crazy thing is she called me up after class. She was mildly annoyed, but she was actually a very nice person. And the craziest thing was that well, first she was interested, like, how did I ever get interested in this stuff? Because she's not used to this for, like, undergrad. Like, most of the kids in the undergrad philosophy class are just like, is it over yet? Right. Let alone not engaging.
Right.
And I said, philosophy has always been an interest of mine since I was young. And, I find these positions absurd, and, I'm glad we had the exchange. And then we talked a little bit, and turns out she was a Christian.
Wow.
Which, like, that was the craziest thing of all, to my mind.
From Christian to moral relativist.
She didn't give up Christianity. And so, I asked, I said, what on earth? Like, how do you hold these things? Like, first off, I think your positions are absurd, as we'll talk about here in a minute. But, like, how do you hold these two commitments together? And her response was just this. She said, relativism is just something I'm trying on for a while. Like it's a fashion, right? It's like, I get philosophies are fashionable, but, like, is this really the philosophical attitude?
She's a professor.
And a professor who was aggressively pushing this stuff too. So, like, don't ever tell me that colleges are not crazy indoctrination camps. Not all of them, not all the time, but it is there. It is there. I lived through it. I did my best to fight against it. But no, that's exactly what a lot of them are a lot of the time. So anyways, I had to put that story in there just because it's so related to this conversation.
Yeah. And you exemplify a good point there, to where, because total relativism is so blatantly self-referentially incoherent, right? And self-refuting, self-defeating, however you want to parse that out, many will retract to the moral relativistic worldview, which states, I'll acknowledge that there is some objective truth, just not when it comes to morality.
Right.
And that's, on its face value, that's logically consistent, because even we will say, yeah, some things are relative, like whether you like vanilla ice cream or chocolate ice cream.
Right.
That's going to be relative to your independent tastes.
Megadeth versus Metallica? Not relative. Megadeth all the way.
Well, coming from where I come from, I have to disagree.
You have your truth, Pat, and I.
I don't know if I can jump on board with that. Maybe John Sorensen will jump on board.
Yeah, we gotta have John be the tiebreaker here. Yeah, but anyways, continue,
so moral relativism is not as blatantly self-contradictory as total relativism is. However, as I point out in the book, in the section where I refute good old-fashioned moral relativism, I do think it falls into self-contradiction when you begin to press with this question. Let's grant, for argument's sake, moral relativism is the way the world really is, and that's reality. The question then becomes, should I live my life in accord with that reality of moral relativism? Now, if you, Pat, the moral relativist, says, first of all, you don't want to say no, because if you say, no, I don't need to live in accord with reality, then you're encouraging that I live my life in an insane way, right? I mean, it wouldn't be good to encourage someone to live contrary to reality. That's the essence of insanity.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to most probably say yes, right? Yeah, you should live. In other words, even if you say no, like, well, why would you even be making the claim? Why would you even be trying to convince me about moral relativism?
There's a tie here between moral and epistemic norms. That's kind of what you're drawing out, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So you're going to have to say, yeah, you need to live in accord with moral relativism, like you ought to. Well, that's at least one absolute moral truth, which then falsifies moral relativism.
Right. The truth is valuable. We should care about it. We should pursue it. Right. So I think that's one of the actually a very good response. Terence Cuneo's got his book out that essentially it's just a sustained defense of the companions in guilt. He's like, if you try to take down the moral system, the epistemic system goes with it, right? So you better be willing to throw, either keep them both or get rid of both. So I think those are good, smart moves. And of course, the other issue is it's just I don't know, maybe there's somebody out there who can somewhat live consistently for 5 minutes with that worldview, but almost everybody is immediately in performance contradiction. Right. Yeah. Same thing, even with my old professor. I don't want to pick on her too much, but it's like, she'd go on this relativistic, monologue, I guess. And then, a couple minutes later, she's morally condemning this or that politician. Right. You can always imagine which side of the aisle, right? It's always consistently
that's right.
Side. Yeah, right. Yeah. But it's that sort of issue that's going on, right? Is like in one sense, you make you adopt a system that itself would be incompatible with not just moral condemnation, but moral praise as well.
That's right.
And then 2 minutes later on Twitter in front of your class, you're issuing all these sorts of moral condemnations, right? So,
Right. And this is one of the things about moral relativism that we find in these modern moral absolutes. Within the framework of moral relativism, human behavior is not subject to moral analysis, whether praise or critique. Human behavior is thereby off of the table. It
right.
cannot be a target of critical analysis.
Yes.
And that's something that we find similar within some of these modern moral absolutes. So, for example, this is one of the chapters within the category of moral relativism. Thou shalt not be a judgmental, hateful bigot. Now, what are we doing when we're labeled with such things? We're simply offering a critical analysis of certain behaviors associated within our contemporary circumstances, LGBTQ community, right? Certain lifestyle choices that we as Christians, both from revelation and reason, conclude are immoral. But then we're labeled automatically with being ill motivated in our judgment. We're judgmental, we're bigoted, and we're hateful. And what I point out in the book, Pat, is that in all of these charges, what's going on is that the behavior is taken entirely off of the table, and our critical analysis is perceived as an attack on the person.
Yeah.
The behavior is not allowed to be a target of critical analysis, but only the person.
Right.
And in my mind, that can be only on either of two possibilities. Either A, there's no such thing as true or false beliefs concerning the morality of lifestyle choices, in which case you have full-blown moral relativism. Or B, the lifestyle choices are somehow synonymous with and collapsed into the very personal identity, in which case there is no behavior to critique. It's only the person. And so you see this similarity between the mental framework of moral relativism, which does not allow human behavior to be subject to critical analysis. And within this modern absolute, you have the same thing. Human behavior is not subject to critical analysis. Only the person is there, such that any critical analysis is perceived as either ill will towards the person, that's hate, or a negative emotional response to the person based upon preconceived biases, that's bigotry, or not caring about what the person actually thinks or feels, and that would be, or even thinking that they're ill motivated, which would be judgmentalism.
Right. Yeah. There's so much to comment on that. Obviously, when you come from so fundamentally different paradigms, conversation can be very difficult. This is something I've put a Substack up on before, is that it's just hard to have productive conversation with people you have almost nothing in common with. And even when you try to patiently explain your position and what you're saying and what you're not saying, I don't know, Karlo. Maybe you've had better luck than me in some of these cases. But yes, obviously from the Christian perspective, from the Catholic perspective, whether you have natural law or virtue ethics, you have a robust action theory, right? Actions matter, right? It's actions that, and here's the other important thing from either of those accounts, you can actually provide an analysis of moral claims and give meaning to moral claims. Like, what does it mean to say something is wrong? But does relativism even give an analysis? Not really. It seems to me that relativism is inherently unstable when you try to like work it out. It either sort of slides into an emotivism where we're just like issuing statements of feels, right?
I don't like that.
Right. Yeah. But we already have emotivism. So why do we need relativism? Or it slides in another direction just to outright nihilism, right? So it's like, what does, like, from a semantic point or a point of like meaning or analysis, like, what does relativism actually do? And it seems to me like when you really try to think it through, it did nothing, right? It's unstable. It doesn't really, it's not as a theory. It's just, it doesn't really help analyze anything, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's dangerous too, because as I point out in my book, in the section where I'm refuting moral relativism, one line of argumentation that you don't see that much that's offered within sort of the apologetical circles, often refuting moral relativism, is getting to what you just brought up. I'm glad you brought that up, Pat, asking, okay, what does moral relativism actually entail or claim, logically speaking? Well, if we back up for a second, what is morality all about? It's about doing good and avoiding evil, right? So notice the notion of the good is intrinsic to morality. So next step is, well, how do we traditionally conceive of the good? Well, it's relative to the kind of thing that the thing is. Good pizza, good computer, good razor, good microphone, good human being.
Right.
So the good for us is relative to our nature as a human being. So think about this. If the good is relative to each individual, well, then it would follow that each individual is not of the same kind of thing. And therefore, each individual is not human being. And so you end up in this inequality among human beings. And so then the question becomes, well, if something happens, you get in my way in my pursuit of what I perceive to be happiness, then I'm justified in squashing you.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting, almost a sort of implicit nominalism in there, which makes perfect sense, right? We often see that these world pictures, like there's a reason most materialists and relativists and skeptics are nominalist and so on, and mechanistic, right? These things sort of, Lloyd Gerson has a lot of good work on this, where he argues it is sort of a bundle deal in these commands. But it's good to pick out what you did there. I also want to highlight that, if you hold like a virtue ethics or a natural law, you brought up the word relative, and there is a relativity. There's an objective relativity.
That's right. That's right.
So there are objective moral facts of the matter, but obviously what is good for us given human nature is not the same thing as what is good for a dolphin or what have you.
We can affirm the proposition that the good is relative. It's just when we unpack that, what we mean is relative to our nature as human beings.
Yeah.
And what we mean by objective morality is the good that's relative to us as human beings. It's objective in that sense. It applies to all peoples of all times, of all nations, etc.
Right. Irrespective of how you feel about it as well.
Correct. Or even your own private judgment, because your private judgment could be flawed and not conforming to what's real about human nature.
Right. So the point is, again, natural law, virtue ethics, we have the resources here to actually give an analysis, right, of our moral language and behavior and stuff like that. But again, just even as a theory, it just doesn't seem like relativism is really doing much of anything. And it's just sort of inherently unstable. And I guess there's another direction it's unstable, right? If it doesn't slide into an emotivism or nihilism, it just slides back to moral objectivity, right? Like once you start to kind of press them with these different challenges. And I know we're going to talk about, well, why don't we just keep moving forward? Because sorry, I'm having a little too much fun. I don't want to keep skipping ahead. I know we were going to talk about, thou shalt not be intolerant and stuff. And that might be a good one to illustrate a few of these points with. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So similar to the thou shalt not be a judgmental, hateful bigot, thou shalt not be intolerant is clearly moral relativism under the guise of an absolutism, because the meaning of tolerance within our contemporary culture is what I call in the book an egalitarian tolerance, where every lifestyle choice, and you could also apply this to beliefs as well, which I think would fit in the total relativism category if we're focusing on beliefs, generally speaking. But whenever within our culture, the tendency is to focus on the lifestyle choices, particularly associated with the LGBTQ community. So the view of tolerance within contemporary culture is we got to accept everyone's lifestyle choices as equal and valid. And that comes out in conversation, right? The minute I try to critique a lifestyle choice, particularly associated with LGBTQ, I'm immediately charged with being intolerant. The implication being is I ought to tolerate that lifestyle choice. But what do they actually mean by I ought to tolerate that lifestyle choice is I ought not to be critical of it. In other words, I need to accept it, embrace it, and celebrate it as just as equal and valid as my lifestyle choice.
Yes, there's been this sort of shift, certainly over, I don't know, last pretty quickly, I think, between the notion of tolerance and acceptance, right?
Right. Because the traditional view of tolerance is I will tolerate your lifestyle choice, even though I think it is wrong. And given my respect for you as a human being and having freedom, I'm not going to physically coerce you to embrace or conform to what I think is the appropriate lifestyle choice, on condition that your behavior is not undermining the equality of relations for us as social animals.
And the kind of funny, sick thing behind all of this, I suppose, is like tolerance implies not accepting something, right?
That is correct.
If you accept something, you don't need tolerance, right?
That's right.
The whole notion of tolerance only makes sense if you're expecting that people do not accept something, right?
That is correct. And so this is the earmark. This is the common characteristic of modernity, where we're redefining terms. We're equivocating on terms. This is why it's so dangerous, Pat, because in all of these modern absolutes, the majority of them, there's equivocation going on.
Of course.
Because on face value, the unsuspecting person's thinking like, yeah, I don't want to be intolerant, if we're kind of going with the general notion that being intolerant, unjustly speaking, is a bad thing, because you can not be tolerant in a just way. We don't tolerate blind people driving, right? But that's a just intolerance. So the common notion of intolerance is sort of connected to injustice. So if we go with that, most unsuspecting people are like, yeah, I don't want to be intolerant.
Right.
But there's equivocation going on, because what's meant in contemporary culture by tolerance is you got to accept the lifestyle choice. And so if you don't, you're labeled as intolerant. But as I point out in the book, not only is it just moral relativism, that's one point to make, but to actually respond to that, right? And say, well, wait a minute. If we're going to be consistent with the logic here, and we got to accept everybody's lifestyle choices, well, then why don't you accept my lifestyle choice of critiquing those other lifestyle choices? Because if you're going to be consistent with your tolerance virtue framework, you need to accept my lifestyle choice. But of course they cannot, right? Because if they do accept my lifestyle choice to criticize other lifestyle choices, well, then they would be losing their initial criticism. And
unless they restrict their principle of tolerance to, we should tolerate all positions that just
except
tolerate other
mine,
positions, right? That just tolerate other positions, right? Yeah,
right. According to their definition of tolerance, the only view that they will accept, celebrate, and embrace is views that are consistent with their view, but not views that are inconsistent with their view. So they become guilty of the very intolerance, not accepting other people's lifestyle choices as equal and valid as they're claiming me to be. So there's a double standard here. I can't be intolerant in their sense, but they can be intolerant in their sense.
Yes. Yeah. And then if you try to further restrict it or qualify it, then it seems a bit contrived, a bit artificial, a bit arbitrary, and we have certainly every right to question, well, why should we accept that as what? Right. I mean, what do we talk about, right? As some political theory, some social theory, right? And that's what makes these conversations hard, is like, just what exactly is being proposed, right?
That's right. We have to always ask that question. What do you mean?
Yeah. Right? What do you mean? Is this are you trying to put forth a legal theory, a political theory, a social, a personal moral theory? Like what exactly is being proposed? And again, these things are often, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps intentionally, not made clear. Right. And that makes, again, productive conversation around this topic exceedingly difficult and often frustrating.
Yeah. And Pat, I would be inclined to be sympathetic to most people in contemporary culture that they're not intentionally being unclear. I think most people just don't think through the common catchphrases or slogans that they adopt and embody from contemporary culture. And, Pope Benedict XVI, right. Pope Benedict XVI, God rest his soul, and I think it was a 1969 radio address. I quote it in my book in the conclusion, where he says, there is a need for minds to probe deeper the slogans of the day. And that's the only way that we're going to recapture the mind of modern man and bring about sanity. And that's basically what my book is trying to do. The New Relativism, Unmasking the Philosophy of Today's Woke Moralists, is to help people probe deeper these modern moral absolutes, which are just catchphrases.
Yeah, man.
Probe deeper, pull back the mask, ask what is meant by these absolutes. And then once we have our target clear, then we can begin shooting the arrows. Then we can begin critically analyzing what these absolutes mean and entail. And hopefully there's enough people out there, Pat. I'm kind of optimistic.
Are
I
you?
think there's enough people out there that have the flicker of reason that the pilot light is on. It just needs to be fanned a little bit. And let's face it, in modern culture and modernity, the intellect is not very sharp because that pilot light of the intellect is not being fanned in an appropriate way.
Right.
So I think if we reintroduce the perennial philosophy, right, which many have been doing, and get people to start thinking clearly, help them along the way, man. Just like a child, you got to help them along the way.
That's right,
they'll come to see the absurdity of some of these modern absolutes.
Yeah, one really hopes so. And you know what? It starts here at Philosophy for the People. The revolution.
Absolutely, I was about to say
that's televised, gentle listeners.
That's why you're doing what you're doing, bro.
Right, good stuff. All right, so sorry, what did we hit? What did we not hit yet? What's our next point here, Karlo, that we want to move on to? Of course, we're not going to spoil the whole book. There's lots of good stuff in here, but maybe we can hit one more nugget.
Yeah, so we already talked about total relativism. We identified "thou shalt not be a white supremacist" as one example of that. One thing I didn't mention is contemporary gender ideology. I argue falls under total relativism. Maybe not initially. It does require a little unpacking, as I point out in the book, but I think ultimately what's at the root of contemporary gender ideology is a total relativism. So I unpack all of that, something we didn't mention yet. I'll just tease your viewers with that. They can get the book at shop.catholic.com. So we talked about moral relativism, a couple of examples there: intolerance, judgmentalism, bigotry, hatefulness. And then the third section is cultural relativism. So one example that I have is the modern absolute, "thou shalt not misinform."
Yeah. Hey, real quick. So for people who just want to get caught up with what I mean by that. So personal relativism is on the moral relativism idea is that, what is right for you might not be right for me, vice versa, right? Cultural relativism is the society determines what is right or what is wrong, right? That's the difference. Yeah.
Yeah. And
what is the society? Is it,
is
it my neighborhood, the state, all United States? Does it have to be 51%, 57%? I haven't found good answers to these. Maybe you have, Karlo, but continue.
Yeah. Well, in the section where I refute cultural relativism, according to the traditional standard lines of argumentation, that's one thing I point out. It's very difficult to define what it even is a society or a culture, or where are the boundaries of the group that are of individuals who are going to determine the truth about reality or the truth about lifestyle choices, right? The morality of lifestyle choices. But what I do, so "thou shalt not misinform," I thought about that one a little bit because that's something that's very much in our face, right? We have heard about misinformation and condemnation of misinformation ad nauseum within contemporary culture, right? And so what we discover is this constant silencing of the opposing view of the consensus view of the elites and the powers that be who control the cultural narrative in the name of protecting the public from misinformation. Now, on face value, we can all get on board with "thou shalt not misinform" if we understand that to don't intentionally lie to people. Right. We can get on board with that. But it seems to me that when I've thought through the daily examples given to us through the news of the powers that be trying to silence opposing views to the consensus view of those in power, it seems as if there is a smack of relativism going on here, if not full-blown relativism, at least a practical relativism. And what do I mean by that? Well, notice how with all of the censoring that's been going on, I use Joe Rogan as an example, that just blew up when he had a couple of doctors on being negative toward COVID-19 issues and the government's handling of it and the vaccine and all of this. You had Twitter and YouTube censor the interviews. You had the White House spokesperson encouraging Spotify, along with doctors and scientists, writing a letter to encourage Spotify to censor those interviews and to silence the opposing view, which was offering an alternative view of what the consensus was offering of the powers that be. And so as I thought through that, I was thinking, well, man, why is this opposition being silenced? why not simply refute the opposition? Why is it that persuasion of the mind is being given up on?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
only punishment is ruling the day. Only punishment and an exile is in the driver's seat.
Punishment and force, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So as I thought through that, I was like, well, man, that's really smacking of good old fashioned relativism, right? Because within the mental frame, within the environment
Yeah.
of relativism, there can be no persuasion of the mind to conform to truth or reality, because there is no objective reality for the mind to be persuaded about. So if there is no persuasion of mind that's available on the table or in the framework or within the environment there, what are you left with? You're only left with force. You can only bring about conformity by forcing people to conform to what you think is real or true. And that's exactly what we're experiencing with our modern culture. There's this similarity with relativism where persuasion of the mind is not on the table.
Right.
That is off the table. And all we're left with is force. So either this, I see either two possibilities here. Either A, the powers that be who are trying to silence the opposing views and not allowing any sort of expression of the opposing view followed by refutation. Like, why are they just silencing with punishment? Either A, there is no truth to be persuaded about, which would just be flat out relativism, or B, it's a practical relativism. Like maybe they think there is truth and they're just lying about it and they don't want people to know it. So they're malicious. So that's a practical relativism, right? Truth might as well not even exist if we're not going to convert to inquire together to try to figure it out.
Yeah. All right. That's interesting. A lot of thoughts on that. And I won't speak too much to the virus of mysterious origin, because I think that these platforms still don't like that very much. But I will just point out, and this, how demonstrated has been, how wrong the elites were on so many issues concerning that. Right. I'm just saying, if we're not going to misinform, there's a lot of information coming from the top down on a lot of that, right? I would be more inclined to point towards the academy on issues like gender theory, right? Where you have these sheer bully tactics being used, right? I mean, how many friends I have, I'm sure you have, that are in the academy, right? That just are so terrified to publish on certain issues because they know they will be terrorized if they do, right?
Rather than allowing their view to be voiced, and then just refute the view. Like if you think the view is not right, if there is a truth to be known and you think that view is not conforming to that truth, well, just refute the view and show why it doesn't conform rather than silencing it.
Now, to play, I guess, a little bit of devil's advocate on this, another way that this might be seen of what could be pushing this perhaps is, I guess a sort of utilitarianism, right? Is that like, well, maybe we're right on this, maybe we're wrong, maybe we're unsure, but if we let this go on, because to put gender theory in the most positive light, and I think this is right of a lot of people promoting it, even though I think that they're wrong about a lot of what they promote, including the outcomes, they think they're doing it because it will reduce harm or something like that, right? And so, maybe they think, well, maybe I don't have the best arguments, but if I, let these people argue against gender theory and they start convincing people, then, oh man, the harm's just going to be catastrophic, right? So we can't let that happen at all, right? And same thing with the other thing you talked about. Maybe they knew they were wrong, maybe they were unsure, but they just said, well, look, if we just let Rogan and these people run their mouths, and they're not right, then the harm, right? And and some of that could actually be quite legitimate, assuming, of course, that you're not doing something like intrinsically evil to promote a certain outcome, right? Like, and we do this all the time. Like, if we're somewhat agnostic and we just got to make a decision in one direction or another, we do think about consequences, right? Well, what are the outcomes going to be? And if I think, well, if I go this way, maybe some good will happen, maybe some bad. But if I go the other way, then it could just be a lot of bad.
Yeah.
then, so it's like, utility is, even though I have objections against utilitarianism, utility itself is something that factors importantly into sound moral decision making and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So what do you think about all that? I'm trying to, like,
No, I
Yeah.
appreciate it. And I've actually been trying to think through that, right? So, comparing what we are experiencing within our modern circumstances of silencing of opposing views to a legitimate or just protection of people from harmful ideas,
Yeah.
right? So, like, for example,
one more quick thing, Carl, before you, because
Yeah.
the other one is just, and I think this is highly plausible, is that the elites are just exceedingly narcissistic and condescending, right? They would just say, Carlo, you're naive if you think that people are letting, intellect steer the way here. They're just persuaded by Joe Rogan's muscles and how funny he is. And that's why we got to shut them up, right? Because they're not,
Yeah.
it isn't the argument that's going to win the day, right? So there's always that
Right.
option too, right?
Yeah. So response to that latter option is just, well, if that's your claim, if it is the case, well, that's sort of a red herring, right? That's a fallacy of relevance. The relevant issue is the claims that are being made by the opposing view. So you're distracting from what's really at issue, and that is the opposing view true or false? And if you think it's false, then refute it, and do it so publicly, and do it so in such a way that it makes it shameful to even embrace, intellectually shameful to embrace the opposing view, because it's been so solidly refuted. But that refutation and thus persuasion, the attempt to persuade the mind of others, is not being done. Now,
Yeah.
with regard to legitimate protection from
I would just
harm,
say one more quick thing about that. I would just say that if I were them, I would say, okay, that is true insofar as my policy hasn't refuted their argument, but I'm not worried about whether it's true. I'm worried about what the best policy is. And I just think that the general population is so dumb that argument doesn't matter, that my policy is that I'm just not going to let argument, win the day, because it's irrelevant to most people, right?
right, and that's just simply pure authoritarianism, in my view. And I mean, there will.
It's not a world I want to live in. Don't get me wrong. I'm
That's
not.
right.
I'm not trying to support what's been going on at all.
Now,
Just,
I mean, technically, what you just said there was an argument. So I guess you are for argument, but only your own arguments, and thus, again, not letting other people argue.
It's an argument for why I just don't think that I need to argue.
People should argue,
right?
Yeah. So that's my initial thought with that. But with regard to legitimate protection from harm, I mean, we protect our kids from viewing certain things or being exposed to certain things because we recognize they're not ready for that yet.
Oh, I censor things all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. And whenever we do, we have a controlled exposure, but along with the refutation. But here's the thing, we're not kids, right? I mean, we are adults, definitely on a spectrum of intellectual capabilities. But, these issues that have come up within our contemporary culture are issues that we as adults need to have information about to make informed decisions about. And so it boils down to the powers that be treating us like children, which we are not.
Yes.
And so that's an injustice, right? Not allowing us to exercise our natural capabilities of intellectual inquiry and informing our choices to make informed decisions. And also, it's not like we're severely mentally handicapped where you got to have some sort of coercion to protect that person from doing harmful things to him or herself.
Yeah, it's infantilizing, and in a lot of these instances, we're talking about encroachments upon what we would argue are really quite fundamental rights that cannot, in principle, be overridden unless there is some really good reason for it. And of course, there's a good slogan, I think it's true, that those who impose burdens of this sort, they have the burden of proof.
That's right. And that's what,
and that's a good practical principle for sure. Right. Yeah.
Good point, because the contemporary issue had to do with imposing certain, the vaccines say, and things.
You trying to get my channel banned, right?
But
the virus of mysterious origin, please.
Yeah. So all I'm saying there is that there is an imposition upon us that demands that we be able to pause and make an informed decision of whether we're going to accept this or not.
Right.
And so to not allow us to express an opposing view and articulate our view and be open to refuting our view if a person is wrong, right? it just like, again, it just smacks of that relativism. And the reason why I say cultural relativism is precisely because the truth that's being demanded that want people conform to is the truth among those who are in power and establishing a consensus there. And so it's rather than a conformity to an individual's view, it's the group's view.
Right.
Well,
It's
there's
the
another
elite.
group
It's
that
the elite
that's
group's
right.
view. Right.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Which is a very interesting form of cultural relativism, I suppose. But yeah.
Yeah, but that's a particular society, right? That we could deem that as a
Right.
particular unique group and a society that is asserting things that people need to conform to.
Yeah.
And so it just, even if it's not, I'll concede, even if it's not outright relativism or cultural relativism, like there is no truth independent of the society, it's definitely a practical cultural relativism because truth might as well not exist because all that's being practiced on the ground is my truth, that is the group's truth, the elite group's truth, and not your truth.
Yeah.
And silencing the opposition. So that's all I'm saying in that chapter is that
And that's and like, look, the practical distinction is a good one. I've often, drawn that with respect to nihilism, is that a lot of people aren't like, if you really ask them, they probably wouldn't claim to be nihilists, but they sure seem to live like it a lot of times. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a legitimate thing to point out for sure. Karlo, this has been an absolute blast. Tell us a little bit more about what is in this book. We've obviously just scratched the surface, and where the best place for people to grab a copy. Cool cover, by the way. I opened this up. I'm like, that is a cool cover. I like that.
I'll be sure to share that with the team over here who developed that cover. Yeah. So, I mean, we've already laid out the structure of the book, broken up into those three categories of total relativism, moral relativism, cultural relativism. A total of 10 modern moral absolutes that I categorize to fit within each of those categories. And at the end of each of those sections, like I said before, I have a section where I give the good old-fashioned lines of argumentation to refute those forms of relativism, generally speaking, as opposed to them being restricted and identified in their cultural forms.
Yeah.
So if your viewers are interested in learning how to engage these modern moral absolutes, and trust me, man, from people I've been talking to, they're running up against these day in and day out in the workplace, at home, at the dinner table with loved ones. If they're interested in learning how to sift through the modern insanity and try to help people reestablish the two absolutes of thou shalt think and thou shalt be sane, then they want to get my book. And they can get it at shop.catholic.com. It's also available on Amazon and any Catholic bookstore near you.
Well, obviously, I'm going to encourage people to acquire a copy of this very fine volume. And Karlo, before we go, where can people keep up with you personally and your work and any other new projects you want to tease before we say goodbye?
Yeah, so they can follow me at Catholic.com. All of the work that I do for Catholic Answers, it goes through Catholic.com. I have my own website, KarloBroussard.com, where I host some of the stuff that I do at Catholic Answers. I don't do social media. The only social media that I have is via Catholic Answers. So they can just follow me by tagging on to Catholic Answers, signing up for the daily emails, going to the website, looking up Catholic Answers on the YouTube channel, following Catholic Answers on Facebook. And so that's how they can follow my work there. As far as future projects, I'm working on my dissertation for my PhD in philosophy. I'll be defending it next year at this time with Dr. Gavin Kerr, St. Patrick's Pontifical University in Maynooth, Ireland. I finished the dissertation. Dr. Kerr actually just emailed me his comments from the last couple of chapters. So I haven't gone through it yet.
Yeah, I've gotten his red ink all over a couple of my papers and articles too, so I know what that's like.
So I'm pretty excited about that, working on that. A lot of other personal movements that I'll be willing to share later.
Cool.
That's going on. And then I got the green light to do a book project here at Catholic Answers for the intercession of the saints.
Nice.
So I'm working on that as well. So a lot in coming down the pipe there.
Yeah. Karlo, doing great work. God bless you.
Thank you, buddy.
Gentle listeners, please, if you're enjoying what we're doing here, like, share, comment, leave your thoughts, whatever they may be, and we will see you in the next video.